Welcome back to Advancing with Amy, Mental Health Warrior and Neurospicy Mama, the podcast where we journey through the landscapes of the human mind and body to uncover the keys to mental well-being. I'm your host, Amy, and today we are delving into the profound connections between our mind, body, and emotions with a truly wonderful guest. Ever wonder how your body's stress response is intricately wired into your emotional health? Or how ancient wisdom and modern science converge to help us navigate through life's toughest challenges? You're in the right place. Joining us today is Ramona Beresford-Howe, a registered nurse turned psychologist who has walked through the corridors of medical and psychiatric emergency departments and has served as a forensic psychologist within the California prison system. Ramona's insights are not just theoretical, they're forged from years of frontline experience and a deep understanding of the mind-body connection. In this episode, you'll learn how the vagus nerve serves as the main highway for calming your mind and body, the science behind trauma and our physical reactions to life-threatening situations, practical grounding techniques to reorient yourself and engage your prefrontal cortex, the connections between trauma, emotional regulation, and recurring life patterns, and a sneak peek into Ramona's upcoming book, The Take 5 Steps to Reduce Stress. Plus, Ramona shares her personal journey to becoming a beacon of strength for her clients and teaching others to reclaim their power and self-confidence. Stay tuned as we unravel these intricate webs and learn how to manage our autonomic nervous system, reduce stress, and build resilience. It's a conversation you won't want to miss. Let's dive in. Wow, you have had a fascinating career, Ramona. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm happy to be
Here. Tell us a little bit about why the mind-body connection is so important.
Well, I'd have to say that it's so important because it is connected. And the brain, what happens in the brain has a lot of influence on what happens in the body and vice versa. We know by a lot of different research and studies over the years that the stress response in particular is intimately tied up between those two systems. And it turns out that the research has shown that the nervous system is controlled by the brain, but also feeds back from the body into the brain through the vagus nerve. So there's a lot of information that we didn't used to have that is now informing both medical care and psychiatric care, which is a really good thing for both communities. We still have a long way to go in understanding how the body works in connection with our nervous system and with the brain.
Definitely. I want to give a little bit of more information on the vagus nerve. Can you explain what the vagus nerve is and how that works?
Sure. The vagus nerve is what is called the main highway of communication in the branch of the nervous system called the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the more calming breaks of the mind-body interaction. So when we have a high stress response and we need to be all systems go, the sympathetic nervous system is activated. That's the one branch of the autonomic nervous system. But the vagus nerve is the main highway of the breaks that happen when we can relax, when we're not under stress, when we're not under threat. And it's what happens when we are feeling really good about ourselves and feeling really calm and at peace in the world. It innervates a lot of the different organs in our gut, and it communicates with the heart as well. And it also communicates back all the way up to the brain, which is just a fascinating sort of loop to take a look at, because what they're now finding out is information about what's called the gut brain.
That
Right?
is
And it turns
fascinating.
out, yes, it is. It's incredible. And we still are just beginning to dip our toes into the waters of information of what all this means, because it turns out that our gut microbiome influences the signals that go back up to the brain. So we don't even know yet what that means. We don't have there's a lot left to learn. But we do now know that there is communication that happens as a result of this vagus nerve being the connector between all of this. I'm really looking forward to hearing what the researchers come up with, because I think that it's going to be groundbreaking in the connection and understanding how we work as an organism all
Right.
together, because we don't
Well,
know a lot.
no, we don't. But it's interesting. We already have sayings like I can feel it in my gut, or you get butterflies in your stomach, or things like that. So it's like we knew there was some kind of connection.
Sure, ancient wisdom had a lot on us, because what we did as a scientific, industrialized community society is we threw out the ancient wisdom. We just discarded it. We're like, oh, the Middle Ages and the Age of Darkness. No, none of that. None of that was real. Oh, okay.
Right.
So now what do we do instead? Well, now we have to reinvent the wheel and rediscover those sorts of things that we can now attribute to what the ancients knew about our bodies and how things worked,
And
which
how does
is
this all play into trauma?
so trauma is got multiple components, as you know. It has what I like to tell my clients is that most trauma has to do with a lack of control. You lose control over your surroundings. You lose control over the effects of whatever's going on your physical body. It is almost always a life or death situation by definition, right? If you're traumatized, it's because you have the sense of a loss of control because your life is in danger and you're threatened. Trauma is a very interesting topic to try to define, because oftentimes we forget that childhood trauma is very different than adult trauma. As adults, we are aware that our life is in danger, but as children, we're not necessarily. And the things that present us with that loss of control are very different for children than they are for adults. But perhaps that's a little bit of a different topic, because the question you asked me was, how does it show up in the body? What happens to our bodies? Why is it physical? And so if we're going to be threatened, if our lives are going to be threatened, then that is a physical, we have to have a physical reaction to try to save ourselves from it most often. And of course, the stress response, we've now discovered is more deeply embedded within us and has more reactions than just fight or flight. There's also faint or freeze, where dissociation comes into that is up for discussion because it hasn't clearly been defined. But dissociate, and there are some other ones. There's also please and appease adaptation of those four different responses that the body has. But that's the point. The body has those responses because the limbic system in the brain, the emotional centers of the brain, deeply embedded within them is the amygdala. The amygdala is responsible for determining if our life is in danger. And thank God we have that piece of adaptation within our brain, because it operates way faster than the speed of thought, which is why oftentimes we react without knowing that we've done so.
Okay.
We say a speeding car is coming towards us and we out of the way and then go, I don't know how I knew to do that. I didn't make myself do that. Something just happened, because the amygdala has started off the chemical reactions that cause the flight part of our response that way faster than the speed of thought, the way that it works, that it's so quick. So again, that is all physical.
Yeah,
That is a
makes
physical
complete
response.
sense. Can you have a response, or does it have to be physical life and death?
No, see, that's the thing. The amygdala is binary, completely binary. It has an on-off switch. It doesn't have shades of gray. It's not able to contemplate whether or not this is real or whether or not this is could be this or could be that. It doesn't do any of that kind of stuff. It is either on or off. It communicates with the hippocampus. The hippocampus communicates with other parts of the brain involved in memory and emotion and those kinds of things. And there's kind of this relay system that happens, again, faster than the speed of thought, that says, are we in danger? Psychological trauma presents as if we are going to die or could die.
That's what I was thinking. Yeah.
Yeah. And so the amygdala says, on, go.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. It initiates over 1,400 different chemical reactions in our brain and body.
Wow.
I know, right? When I heard that, I was like, oh, please don't anybody make me memorize those.
That's funny. So tell me a little bit about, I know you worked in the prison system, and now what is your clientele like? Who are you working with now?
Now I work mostly with, my clients tend to be mostly women for personal reasons, and mostly childhood trauma, because childhood trauma, as I said earlier, presents somewhat differently than adult trauma. And this is also an area that we're only beginning to explore as far as how does that present for post-traumatic stress disorder. A lot of therapists don't believe, they have difficulty, I think, defining the first criteria for the diagnosis of PTSD, which is that you have witnessed or been involved in directly or had a perception of a life-threatening experience. And of course, as children, we don't understand that when we need to eat and there's only mustard in the house, that is life-threatening. So we can't go to a therapist as an adult and say, well, I almost died because there was only mustard in the house for 3 days. That doesn't occur to us. We don't have that understanding as children, but the amygdala does.
Mhm. Yeah, I
Okay.
got
So what
chills thinking about that. All these poor children that have trauma and don't even know where it's coming from.
that's the biggest problem that we have. And I believe from my personal experiences that PTSD is severely underdiagnosed in our society.
If someone is having symptoms, what kind of symptoms are they having that might alert them to that they've got some trauma or PTSD?
Generally, what I find from particularly women with PTSD from childhood is they have emotional dysregulation. They have freakouts, or if I can use this language, what I call losing your shit. I think we can all relate to that.
That's
Um,
fair.
yeah. And so they have unstable relationships often. They have repetitive patterns of dealing with partners who are abusive because, in the traditional way of looking at that was that it mimicked the childhood patterns of abuse that one gets used to. And so then you grow up and you go out, that's what you know, that's what you end up with. And you don't even know how you did that, but it hits some of the familiar mirroring that you got as a child.
You just
So,
rehack that over and over again.
yeah, so there's patterns of dysfunction that happen with PTSD, with chronic PTSD. And in childhood, they're coming to recognize what they call complex PTSD as a result of chronic abuse over time, but it's still not considered an official diagnosis in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for diagnosing. So hopefully that'll change in the next iteration of the DSM.
I was wondering what kind of hope is there out there for someone suffering from PTSD or CPTSD? What can they do?
There's a lot of different treatment modalities for PTSD that work for various people. I was listening to your podcast with Dr. Hord, and I loved what she had to say about finding the right fit for your therapist, but it also means finding the right treatment for you. One of the best things, she mentioned this too, was the mindfulness meditation. And they've done a ton of research on it. Yay for the scientific community, because what they found out is that there are brain changes amongst those people who qualify for if there was a diagnosis of CPTSD, they would qualify for that. They had chronic childhood abuse. They had chronic abuse over time, and neglect counts as one of those. They found that there are areas of the brain that are smaller, in charge of emotional control in particular. And what that means is that there's not as many neurons and not as many neuron connections, networks that allow one to regulate their emotions. Okay. And there's a lot of reasons for that. It's because they are in a continual state of hyperarousal and on guard constantly all the time. And that's one of the things my clients will frequently tell me is I'm always waiting for the other shoe to drop.
Yeah, that's a hard way to live.
It is a very hard way to live, and it's unfortunate because there's a lot of people out there that kind of stuff is happening to.
Right. But there is
So
hope. They can basically rewire the way they're thinking and
there
feeling.
is hope. And here's a very interesting piece of the hope. Okay. Because of the communication that we're only just now beginning to understand between the brain and the body, we forget how the body is reacting to that continual level of stress. And because of that, we often neglect the somatic component of treatment. And what I find is that people that are particularly dysregulated, people that are under continual and obvious and current danger, for instance, a stalking victim that is still concerned with that perpetrator stalking them and having access to them, and they still feel in danger, they're still in the war zone, basically. In my experience, best is somatic therapy.
And that's touch
So that-
therapy, right?
Not necessarily.
No.
No, it can be physical grounding, getting
Okay.
back into your physical sensations, because often what we do when we've been abused is we disconnect around the level of the throat. Like I'll often, before those sayings that we have in our society, what women will often say is, I can't find my voice,
Ah,
right? And
yeah.
they'll say things like, I just couldn't talk at all. Or my throat was so tight that I couldn't move. Right? And so that allows a very good defense mechanism to take over, which is the dissociation. So that if you're being physically attacked, you don't feel it as much because you've gone away in your mind. If you are suffering from the trauma of sexual assault, you can dissociate away from it because it's the only control you might have in keeping yourself safe. So for those people, the best treatment is to ground back into the body. Now, I find that this works the best when you are coupling this with a positive affirmation, if you will, or a mantra, whatever you want to call it, of reminding yourself that you are currently in the present moment actually safe,
Right.
so that you can start to believe that. Because when you're in that continual state of arousal, there's nothing anybody can say or do that's going to convince you you're safe.
That makes sense. Do you think it's becoming more common, or you think people are just becoming aware of it?
Well, remember I said that I think that PTSD is very underdiagnosed in our
Yes.
society. And I think the answer to your question is yes. I think it's more common to recognize. Not that it's more commonly happening or that it's becoming a buzzword that we're all just kind of taking on.
Right.
I think that we're recognizing it more often now. Back in caveman days, we had to connect with other people and with ourselves in order to stay alive. But the threats were different. We developed that whole system of fight or flight, freeze or faint as a defense mechanism against the threats that were real. The life expectancy wasn't even 30 years back, thousands of years ago. Now it's longer. Now we don't have the same, there's no saber-toothed tigers out there.
Right.
There's no venomous snakes, hopefully, unless you're out in the jungle, right? But in the cities, we don't see that, right? The threats are just not as prevalent.
Right.
And dangerous situations just don't happen as often to us. So what our brain has done, since we still have all those adaptive mechanisms that kept us alive back then, the brain is interpreting them now. The brain is interpreting the things that happen to us in different ways. So here's what happens. We feel like when our boss criticizes us, that's life altering enough to be threatening. So the amygdala, remember, is binary. It doesn't have shades of gray. It doesn't know the difference between life altering and life threatening. It just goes, whoop. And the next thing you know, this is kind of how PTSD works. The amygdala gets turned on. Our autonomic system goes kabooey. It's all up here, up in the air, like activated. And we start having these thoughts that support it. Oh my God, I'm going to lose my job. Oh my God, then I'm not going to be able to pay the bills. How am I going to be able to keep my car? What am I going to do if I don't have my car? I'm going to lose it. I'm going to end up homeless. I'm going to be on the street. And we have continued the arousal of the autonomic nervous system. We're still way up there in this activated state.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Makes complete sense. So what do you do if you're in that situation and you're having that response?
The best thing after you find out the grounding techniques that work, so the first thing is to get back into your body. And I often tell my clients to do things like, if they find themselves triggered, and generally the best way to know that you've been triggered is to recognize a feeling of overwhelm. If you feel overwhelmed in any direction, you're triggered. If you feel angrily overwhelmed by your anger, if you feel overwhelmed by fear, overwhelmed by sadness, you can say, yes, I've been triggered. So that's the best clue that you're going to have to whether or not you've been triggered, because often we don't know. We've been living with this for so long. We don't recognize it. The second best way to recognize if you've been triggered is to figure out when you're not triggered, what your body does when you are.
Okay.
So usually I'll ask my clients, can you go back and remember a time that you were triggered and tell me how your face felt? What happened in your face? Where did you feel the most discomfort in your body? Sometimes I'll point to their chest and go, oh, I couldn't breathe. Sometimes they'll feel like, oh, I got this pain in my shoulders because my shoulders are going up to my ears. Or sometimes I'll recognize that I've just been frowning, or, whatever the case might be. I have butterflies in my stomach, or I feel like I'm nauseous and going to throw up. Whatever the case might be for you, recognize it so that later when you can go, oh, yeah. And then do some of the grounding techniques. Like I'll have people stamp their feet really hard on the ground. Clap your hands really loudly. And then the second part of getting grounded is to get back into what's called the prefrontal cortex. This part of your brain, right in front, back of your forehead, right in front of your brain, is the higher part of your brain that allows us to attend, concentrate, plan things out, where most of our thinking is done, where our memories relay, one of the things it does is it shuts down the prefrontal cortex and the verbal centers of the brain. Like, you don't have to be thinking and reasoning. You just have to beat feet.
Okay. Which is why people can't come up with the words they need.
If you've ever had that, I just had a fight with my spouse thing, and I wish I'd have said, that's because you were emotionally triggered to where the amygdala would shut down the verbal centers.
Right. And that's why I've explained to my daughter, the calmer she stays, the more rational she can be and think things through.
Exactly. That's beautiful. I love that. So when you use grounding techniques that activate the prefrontal cortex, it sends another message backwards to the amygdala. Oh, if I can stop long enough to do multiplication tables, guess what? We're safe.
Wow, that's smart.
So I will have clients do multiplication tables. 1 times 5 is 5. 2 times 5 is 10, right? Because to do a couple of different things, it's not just that easy to do the multiplication tables. You can count to 20, but you have that kind of on your automatic sensory stuff going on in your brain. The multiplication tables involve more relays in the brain so that you have to be intentional. You have to focus. You have to really concentrate on, especially as you get up higher.
Right.
So there's somatic things that you can do, and then there's executive functioning things that you can do that will help you to ground. So that's one of the first steps that you can do, right? And you can see how you're using your body and your mind to control that emotional dysregulation. Because if you couple any of those with the thought, oh yeah, I'm safe. So it's like 1 times 5 is 5. I'm safe. Now, the best one, of course, is something that has been kind of utilized it's getting mainstream, and I love that, is the taking of the deep breaths, right?
Mm-hmm.
And here's what happens when you take the deep breaths. First of all, you have to intentionally take the deep breaths, which activates the prefrontal cortex. Yay. Sends the message back to the amygdala. We're fine. So you take a deep breath intentionally and you expand out your chest as you inhale. Guess what that does? It drops your diaphragm down and activates the vagus nerve.
Oh, wow. Okay.
The vagus nerve is the superhighway of the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the brain. You can't have the sympathetic and the parasympathetic operating at the same time.
Wow. This is so
Okay?
interesting.
I love science. I'm such a
Yeah.
science geek. So you take this deep breath, right? And you activate the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve interacts with your heart, but it interacts in a way that sounds a little contradictory. It activates the heart to slow down. So if your breathing is slowed down and your heart rate is slowed down and you're using the prefrontal cortex to do all this purposefully, you're sending 3 messages now to the amygdala that you're safe.
Wow. I like
So
that.
you're triple dipping.
That's
Deep
great.
breaths are like the biggest, best thing. Deep breaths just really can help you get there, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Those are 3 steps of great advice. So I'm wondering, where can people find you to access your help and sign up with you?
So I am working right now on a book called The Take 5 Exercise, 5 Steps to Reduce Stress, where I explain all of the neuroscience that I sort of briefly introduce here. And I talk about how this came about in our evolution and how the steps each work. Because what I do is I couple those deep breaths and the neuroscience behind it with cognitive behavior treatment, which is about how to change your thoughts to change your feelings. But you can't get to the how do I change my thoughts to change my feelings until you're grounded enough to think,
Yeah, that makes perfect
right?
sense.
But then I do this really beautiful thing in my opinion, which is then I couple it with mindfulness meditation practices. And so when that book is out, I will be selling it, relatively. It'll be an ebook. It's not going to be that long. But you can find me at Igniting You with the letter U as in university, because I like to teach and I want to teach people and women in particular how to ignite themselves into their best self and their kindest, most gentlest to themselves self, and help them learn how to be their own champion. So I am working on a website right now called ignitingyou.com. And I have a Facebook page for Ramona Beresford Howe, and I'm working on a Facebook page for Igniting You as well. And if anyone is interested in working with me one-to-one in coaching, then I have some spots available for that. All you would need to do is access those Facebook pages and let me know that you're interested.
Great. Sounds like you have a wonderful program. I really enjoyed listening to you today and learning a lot. So
Oh,
thank you for
good.
coming on and doing that. Is there anything that you'd like to leave our listeners with today?
Yeah. The biggest takeaway that I want to talk about for just a minute is how that self-criticism is something that women have been trained to do. And I really would encourage everyone to notice when they're being self-critical and having self-doubts or insecurities and flip it. Just flip it. Make it something that is not maybe the direct opposite of what you just told yourself so that you can believe it. Make it just a little bit of a side trip. Maybe my boss was right about what they said to me, but I have some other good skills too. Be
I like
kind.
that.
Be kind.
I like that. Thank you so much. All right. Well, this was Ramona, and I really enjoyed today. Thank you for coming, and hope a good weekend.
Thank you, you too. And you're very, very welcome. I appreciate the opportunity.
Well, that wraps up our enlightening conversation with Ramona. We've delved deep into the mind-body connection, explored the vital role of the vagus nerve in calming our systems, and examined the intricate responses of the amygdala. Ramona's insights on childhood trauma, the struggles with PTSD, and her emphasis on ancient wisdom and self-compassion have provided us with invaluable knowledge. For those looking to take actionable steps towards reducing stress, remember to check out Ramona's book, The Take 5 Steps to Reduce Stress, where she dives into neuroscience, cognitive behavioral techniques, and mindfulness meditation to help manage your emotions. You can connect with Ramona on Facebook under Ramona Beresford Howe or under Ignite space U, the letter U, and I'll make sure to leave all her information in the show notes. Ramona, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us today. It has been a truly enriching experience. And to all our listeners, if you found this episode helpful, please take a moment to rate, review, and share Advancing with Amy, Mental Health Warrior and Neurospicy Mama with your friends and family. Your support helps us reach others who can benefit from these important conversations. Until next time, stay strong and keep advancing, warriors.